Hi guys, I am Megan Odekirk and I'm a Easter member myself. I attend Easter with my husband and our 4 kids. And by profession, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so I own a clinic in Eagan, just up the road from Pilot Knob. And this is a topic that is not always easy to do a deeper dive into. And it's one of those topics that um, you don't want to be a part of this club, right? But it's something that we all experience at some time. We know it's unavoidable. And so I do think it's important to kind of understand what grief and loss can look like a little bit more. So I really appreciate the opportunity to work with Pastor Brandon on this series. And our hope is that we can tag team it a little bit, with tonight's portion being more of the education piece, where we do a little bit more learning about the topic, and then he will follow up with the support group piece next week with more discussion kind of related to both what we've learned tonight, but also whatever else people are needing from the support part. This talk will be different than the next education piece that I do, but it will all be related to grief and loss. So there's a PowerPoint that we're going to share. My trusty sidekick is helping me out.
Yeah, this is always the risk, is to leave me in charge of the technology. Here we go. Okay, is that showing up?
Yes. I am not a technology person myself either, so we're in the same boat. I don't know if that's good or not good. But so we can go ahead and go to the first slide, the next slide then. And when talking about, when Pastor Brandon and I were talking about this series, one of the things that we were talking about is how there's so many terms that are used when we talk about grief and loss, and they're used sometimes interchangeably. And so kind of coming to an understanding of what does that mean. So when we think about what is grief, I put this quote in there because I think it's a helpful quote. And it says, "Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. The price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve." And I think that's important. So I'll just kind of leave that quote with you, just to kind of have your own thoughts. And in just a second, I'm going to ask that you guys, if you feel comfortable, we can share just kind of what your reaction is to hearing that kind of quote. So we can go on to the next slide. So when we talk about grief, if you look up definitions to grief, there's numerous articles and many books that have been written on the topic. But for our purposes, I want you to think about grief as the normal reaction to a loss. Grief is completely normal. There's nothing pathological about the process of grieving. It's been happening for all time, basically. We know even from what we learn in our biblical teachings that Jesus wept, right? There's a grief that happens when we experience a loss. One of the things that Pastor Brandon and I were talking about earlier too is that this year, particularly with 2020, we've experienced all kinds of loss that we maybe couldn't have even ever anticipated happening. So grief doesn't only have to follow a loss that resulted from death. It can be many things. So when we look at grief is a normal reaction to loss. And then if you want to go to the next one. So here's some things that can be considered a loss. It can be physical. So that would be something we lose, like our house. If it burns down in a fire, we can lose property. We can get our house broken into. We can lose items that way. Or it can be symbolic or social, like we experience loss in other ways, like going through a divorce is very much a social loss. Coming to terms with health status can be a loss. Not being able to have a successful pregnancy, if that was a goal, that can very much be considered a loss. Some people losing a job, some people just losing status. You know, if you think about when we lose jobs, how quickly we can lose our status. Maybe we lose groups of friends then because we're no longer working at that location. Maybe we don't get to do the same things we used to do, take the same vacations, drive the same kind of cars. So when we think about loss, there's so many things that you guys can see are falling under this category. And a lot of times, people expect grief to come after death. They don't always expect grief and aren't even always as forgiving with when people are grieving these other kind of losses. So I think it's important to talk about because we need to honor that loss exists in many forms. If you want to go to the next slide. This slide is just particularly about bereavement. When we think of bereavement, it's referring to the specific length of time. It's the act of experiencing the loss and then the length of time. And for those of you that have experienced a loss and had that impact your job, you might know that some people qualify for bereavement leave. And if you ask my opinion, the bereavement leave at many companies is a joke, really. It's kind of like, take your 3 days, get over it, come back to work, and be ready to go. And there's just no way to quantify the number of days people need to go through this process. So bereavement for our purposes is a definition as far as that length of time, but in no way, shape, or form am I suggesting that there is a certain length of time that one should go through, or that one should take to go through grief. That's very unique to each individual. So I want to take a closer look at grief, but before we do, I want you guys to think about that quote. I don't know if you can go backwards real quick, just to show them that quote. Now that we've talked about kind of what grief is, I'll read the quote again, and then maybe we can pause the video just to get some feedback. Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love, and the only cure for grief is to grieve. So we can pause it right there.
Zoom recording.
Okay, so we're going to take a closer look at understanding what grief is and how it affects us. If you want to hit the next button. So first thing is, grief is a process. And we're going to get into the stages of grief in just a little bit, but it's important to know that this is not a linear process. There's also not a time length, again, for this process. A lot of times when you think about grieving, self-help books, maybe even support groups, maybe even our friends or family kind of say, okay, well, you just have to get through that first year because there's a lot of firsts that you experience. But if you've ever had a major loss, you know that it's not like that first year goes by and then you're just completely in a different place. You will always be remembering that person or that relationship, or something could always trigger that loss. So it's a process. It's an ongoing process. The next part there is what we just talked about with Mariah, that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. a lot of times, just in general, unfortunately, human nature causes us to look at other people in judgment. So we judge people for how they mow their lawn. We judge people for their decision to send kids back to school or not during COVID. We um, judge moms for wanting to stay home or not stay home with kids. Um, and I think this is another area, unfortunately, that sometimes it feels like there's judgment there, as if there is a right or wrong way for us to grieve. And it's just really important to remember um, that that grief is a process that we experience in multiple ways. It's a very unique and individual process, and it's one that we all collectively experience at some time. So there can be lots of advice given out of you should just do this, or you need to just do this, um, or this is what worked for me. I'm sure it will work for you. But part of the process of grieving is figuring that all out on your own and getting really comfortable with what do I need during this grieving process to help me with this loss. If you want to go to the next one, you can. So some of the factors that the grieving process depends on could include the personalities of the individuals involved, um, the nature of the relationships, what our connection is to those people, the cause of the loss, um, whether it's sudden or expected, if there's any associated trauma that comes from the loss that can complicate things. Um, if there's a car accident, for example, um, and multiple people in the family are involved in a car accident, and then one of the members passes away from that accident. Um, you can see that there's just multiple layers there with the trauma itself, and then also the loss, and then expected or unexpected loss. And again, when we think about loss, we are not just talking about death. It could be like the sudden loss of a job. It could be all of a sudden your spouse tells you they want to get a divorce. Or it could be what happened to all of us in March when life came to a standstill and it was completely unexpected. So just loss of socialization as we knew it, loss of connection to others. So that was very unexpected. You can go ahead to the next one there. Um, Another factor that plays into what the grief process looks like is the idea that when we think of mourning and like rituals, it's often impacted by religious and cultural kind of customs or traditions. There are certainly different religions that have expectations for how you handle yourself when you're mourning. Um, what you need to wear, how you need to carry yourself. And some of those are historical customs that have changed over time, and some places in the world those customs still are very present. It's also impacts how we say goodbye to loved ones too. Religious and cultural customs definitely impact those ceremonies as well. Okay, you can go to the next. Sometimes, when we talk about grief, there can be this fear that if the grieving process lessens, or if um, if it feels like it ends, which again we know it doesn't really end, but if it feels like it ends, it almost can feel like there's a betrayal. The person that experienced the loss can feel some guilt or shame around moving on. Um, and I've worked with clients of a variety of ages, and one that stands out to me with this particular example is many, many years ago. I was working with a young client, and I actually ended up working with her for probably about 10 years or so, from the time she was in elementary school all the way through high school. And the reason she was seeing me was she suddenly lost her dad. He had a heart attack on the job, and then they had to uproot their family and move all the way across country and come to Minnesota. So she had multiple losses. Um, And when we first started working together, we were like in the year of the first. So we were talking about like, you know, traditions and customs and how they wanted to celebrate or to mark the anniversary of different things that they passed. And what I noticed is that each year there were little changes that would happen. So, um, if it was, oh, on his birthday, we always make his favorite pie. Um, then as they got older, it was like, oh, well, we can't make it tonight because we have this sporting event or we have this activity, so let's do it tomorrow night or let's change. And I think some people, as those traditions change or as they morph a little bit, there can be that feeling of guilt of, you know, like almost feeling bad that they're not feeling the need to have those traditions anymore. Like they can still remember that person without needing to do those same traditions. Um, and so it's important to kind of remember that because again, that ties back into there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And so some people might need those traditions and need to hold onto that for years and years, and other people might not, and that's okay. So I'd like to talk about the impact of grief on a person, but first I want a quick pause just to see if there's any questions that you might have. So we'll wait just a sec for Pat. This is the impact of grief on a person, and this by no means is the end-all, be-all, exhaustive list, but these are just some symptoms that we're going to talk about first, and then we'll talk about some consequences or some after effects that sometimes come along with grief. So a lot of people, especially in my line of work, like a lot of people um, ask, like, what's the difference between grief and depression? And a lot of times there is a lot of overlap because, as Pastor Brandon's going to flip through the slides here, there's so many symptoms of grief that are also symptoms of depression. So sadness, lack of motivation, so not feeling like doing things, withdrawing, maybe you're surrounded by friends or family, but you're just feeling like you'd rather withdraw or kind of isolate, or you don't find yourself wanting to go out pre-COVID times. Um, you just don't want to do stuff. Poor hygiene, not feeling like we even have the energy to take care of ourselves, to shower, to get good sleep, to eat well. Sometimes just feeling very forgetful, like we can't retain, a lot of information. Anger, of course, is a big one. Sometimes anger at the person or the situation. Um, or sometimes angry, at other people, just an irritation. There can definitely be an impairment to daily functioning. Maybe people might notice that um, their boss is kind of asking them like, hey, we've noticed you've been coming into work lately or having to like leave a lot for long lunch breaks. Are you okay? What's going on? Crying. Um, is a big one. Trouble sleeping, and that could be falling asleep or staying asleep. Numbness, just feeling. Some people actually do have like a physical numbness, but in this particular case, I'm talking about like that emotional numbness of just feeling like you can't almost feel anything. Loss of pleasure, so things that maybe you're used to do just aren't as fun, or you don't enjoy them as much. I had one client that shared that she and her spouse of many, many years liked to go golfing. And so a bunch of her friends, um, said, hey, let's go golfing. Like, let's do that. It'll be fun. You'd love to do that. And she said that while she was just driving around the golf cart, it just wasn't the same for her. So those things that she used to enjoy doing, she's now finding are not as enjoyable. So for unintended consequences, and I know consequences is kind of a, a sketchy word to use because it sounds almost like punishment, right? Like punishment for grief. But I think these are things that we need to consider that can happen after a loss that we don't even often think about. So our physical health can definitely take a toll. Um, Again, not sleeping, maybe losing weight or gaining weight, not taking care of ourselves in the same way. If you have medication or things like that, maybe just feeling like I don't even have the desire to take care of myself in that way. Um, some people can definitely have adjustments to their financial status if you lose a partner who is contributing to the household or to, the income for the house, and then that financial income is taken away. Um, then some people even have to move. They can't afford their house after that, and so that's an unintended consequence. Some people are stuck with bills after someone passes away that they didn't intend on because maybe that person had debt that they weren't aware of, or maybe there was medical bills. Maybe there were just things that you weren't planning on having to spend money on. Um, I've had a lot of clients also tell me like there weren't insurance policies, like there wasn't a life insurance policy, or there wasn't, um, any money set aside to help with those kind of expenses. And so then people were all of a sudden stuck with like funeral costs and things that they weren't intending on having to pay for. It can also mean that there's a loss about future plans going unfulfilled. I think that's really important to think about. Um, whether it's I dream of, my dad walking me down the aisle, or I dream of dancing with this person at my wedding, or I dream of retirement and what that's going to be like. Um, I, we had plans to go on vacation, or um, any of those kind of things. And those are just, a few examples. There could be endless examples um, of plans that were made that go unfulfilled or need to be reimagined. The hopeful part is the reimagining part. It doesn't, again, always feel right to do that sometimes, because that, again, can tie into that guilt of it almost feels wrong to reimagine that without this person being a part of it. Um, but that comes in the healing part and the working through part. Family changes can definitely happen. Unfortunately, sometimes families split, especially if there's a blended family and someone passes away. Maybe those kids or those people don't talk to step siblings or step parents anymore. Um, or maybe I think another thing that can happen is just arguments within the family, where people are handling the the grief differently, and that could cause people to get upset and not talk to each other, or get really angry with each other. So those kind of relationships can change. And then again, like loss of property, having to move, having to I had one client that actually wasn't on the title of her house because she got married later in life, and there was no will. Um, and she later found out that the house was in her stepkids' names. So when her spouse passed away, unbeknownst to her, everything went to her stepkids. Not because that was intended, it was just like an oversight. And so all of a sudden she was being asked to move out of her house and property and everything she loved. So there's a lot of things that happen unexpectedly with loss. Even when a loss is known or anticipated, there can be unintended consequences. We can go ahead and go on. So this was just my little clip to show how people's reactions to grief and to these unintended consequences. Sometimes I feel like that's the inner me. When I get angry, I just picture her waving her little purple hairbrush there. We can go on to the next part. So I said we were going to get into the stages of grief. And these are stages that we hear so often. so many people are well versed in the stages of grief. But again, it's really important to remember that these stages are not linear. A long time ago, it was almost taught as if you have to work your way through these stages. So you start with, denial, and anger and bargaining and sadness. And then, you like work your way through, almost like, okay, you have to get through one before you can go to the other. But what they're really finding out is that some people don't even go through all the stages. And some people go through almost like a wave, like, okay, I'm in denial now, and then I'm going to sadness, but oh, now I'm really angry. And, so it's just constantly kind of going back and forth. So when we kind of just quick look at these stages, the next slide, I want you guys to try to open your minds to not think about it like it's linear, but more like it's circular. But it's almost more like a spider web, even, where at any time you can shoot to any other stage. And I think part of the process of accepting where you're at with your grieving process, as well as where other people are at with their own process, could play into these stages of grief and loss, because it might be that you guys are in different stages. And again, if you think about these stages, if I'm still really feeling like I'm in the anger stage or even the depression stage, it might be hard for me to understand how one of my family members could already be in the acceptance stage. Like, how did you jump, way ahead of me? But again, those are those factors we talked about before, like personality factors and just things that might be different to cause the grieving process to go differently for us. It's, again, not right or wrong. It's just different, and everybody experiences this their own way. So, if we think about like elementary school, maybe this is just me in elementary school, but if you think about elementary school and you're taking a test in like old school paper pencil, of course, because there weren't iPads when I was in elementary school. If there was a test, you'd often notice, or could easily notice, like, oh my gosh, someone else handed in their test. Oh, that person looks like they're on page 2 and I'm only on page 1. And there's just like this almost anxiety that comes from, I need to be moving along at the same pace everybody else is. And I think a lot of people have that same anxiety when we think about these stages, that we need to be all moving along at the same clip. And if we're not, that means that there might be something wrong. Okay, we can go on. So it would be hard to talk about grief without talking about complicated grief. Even though grief is universal, it's not a simple thing. I think a lot of things can complicate grief in the grieving process. Another term for this is often called unresolved grief. And it can be associated with trauma, but not always. And trauma doesn't mean, some people think of trauma as like PTSD from war zones or military scenes, or maybe a sudden car accident. But trauma can look very different to people. And so if the loss itself is traumatic to you, then that's your trauma. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to explain why you experience that as traumatic, and feel like because it's not a fire or an earthquake that you can't consider that trauma. Another reason that grief can be complicated is just having a lot of difficulty accepting the loss. I think in general, radical acceptance is one of the hardest things anybody has to have. It's a skill that most of us struggle to master throughout our whole lives, because a lot of times we associate acceptance with agreement, like we're okay with this. Saying that we're accepting the loss does not mean that we're okay with it. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be hunky-dory and life is just ready to move on. It just means that we are accepting that there is now a void, or there's some position in our life that was filled by someone or something, and now that's not being filled in that same way anymore. Another way grief can be complicated is because it feels almost like a repetitive loop. It feels like I had one client kind of describe it like she gets on the grieving train, and every time she thinks she's going to get off at a station, she just keeps riding that train over and over. And she's like, okay, like I think I'm ready to get off. I think it's okay. And then, nope, okay, we're right back in the same boat. So having that repetitive loop can also be related to complicated grief. And the last thing there that I put about complicated grief is that sometimes it can look like an absence of grief. Sometimes grief is complicated because the relationship was complicated. And that's another hard thing to accept, is that people may have viewed that person differently. Maybe there's some unresolved business with that person, emotional business with that person. And so even though there's a grieving process that's happening, that person may present almost like there's an absence of grief, like they can just move on and act like nothing's wrong or everything's okay. And sometimes grief can be complicated because that person's just not comfortable with grieving. And so therefore, it looks like that absence of grief. It's just not something they're in touch with themselves, or maybe they just don't feel comfortable. So before we go into this part, if we can pause for just a second. So I think, you know, a lot of people wonder, like, how do I know when it's just grief symptoms that I'm experiencing or when it's actually something that would require therapy? And I think that's a good question. And kind of the cop-out answer is it depends. I think it's such a unique decision to everybody. But what I would say is, I don't like to pathologize grief. And I don't like to say that that means that there's something wrong if people are just going through the grieving process. However, some people truly want support as they go through that grieving process. Some people can get that support from a friend. Some people can get that support from family members, or some people do that and they maybe realize that they also need to reach out to a professional. But when you think about the grieving process, these are some things that I want people to think about to help them understand if there's maybe a need for therapy. So grief itself naturally tends to come to an end over time. And again, what I mean by that is not that we ever just stop feeling. We don't ever stop feeling about that loss. It just means that that process of that bereavement time or that process of mourning, maybe we get to a totally different point in it. So naturally, that process does tend to get a little bit better. A lot of people feel that over time. And again, some people throw out that like magic 1 year time of if you can get through that first year. But again, everyone's a little bit different. Some people it takes years and years. But naturally, it does kind of work. You find yourself working through it over time. One thing to know if you might need therapy is if you feel like, again, you're on that repetitive loop. If you feel like maybe it just doesn't seem to end and I'm still experiencing this loss as if it just happened yesterday. The loss and the feelings associated with it are going to ebb and flow, and they're going to change in intensity and duration over time. But if it feels like, wow, I am still feeling as if this just happened yesterday, then maybe that's a good sign that you might need some added support. Of course, it's always important to seek out some professional help if the impact to our daily functioning is severe. I have a client who hasn't been able to go back to work for almost a year because every time she starts to go down that road of going back to her job, she's just feeling really grief-stricken, and it kind of stops her in that process. Some people might just not be functioning, and so they're not paying bills, or they're not, keeping up with friends or family connections. So if that ever happens, then that's important. And again, same there when it involves negative changes to relationships. So sometimes, again, it might be helpful to receive some therapy to sort through all those untanglings of relationships that sometimes happens. Sometimes it's forced to happen against our will, and sometimes it happens naturally when a loss occurs. So, grief therapy, and and we can just even use the term therapy, um, is going to be helpful to people in different ways. Um, just like everything else, you guys are all unique individuals. Anyone that has experienced a loss is going um, to need things for whatever is helpful to them to get through. But one thing that it can help with is it just helps us develop the ability to experience the loss. A lot of times we, especially as like a Western culture, want to shut down the loss. We want to shut down any negative emotions, like don't feel them, nope, can't tolerate it. We avoid painful situations. So sometimes therapy can help because it helps us just hold space and develop that tolerance for those difficult emotions. And then it helps us adjust to those painful grief related changes that happen in our life. It can help us find ways to cope with change. And sometimes that coping comes with figuring out new perspectives. Sometimes if we have tunnel vision of like, but no, this is how I envisioned my life going, or this is how I envisioned my future, this is how I envisioned my relationship with that person. Sometimes we get stuck in that kind of thinking, and so therapy can help us talk through different perspectives and help us maybe expand that a little bit. Grief therapy can also help us continue a relationship with the deceased. You don't forget people. You don't forget people that pass away, that you feel as a loss, even if they're not physically present. Um, it's important to still find a way, again, that's maybe unique to you, to continue a relationship with that person in whatever way you feel is honoring your needs, but also honoring to that person. And therapy can help you to stay healthy. It can help you be accountable, um, not to the therapist, of course, but most importantly, just to yourself. So if you have goals for yourself, if you have things that you want to accomplish, if you have just even expectations for, I want to be able to get out of bed, um, therapy can sometimes help develop skills to help you stay healthy. And it can help to reestablish relationships. These relationships can be relationships that were already present prior to the loss, or it could be to help develop new relationships, maybe new friendships, new romantic relationships, um, whatever that might look like, depending on what the loss was. Um, Sometimes when we experience loss or we experience pain, we again want to shut down to avoid those emotions. So it's hard to experience the other relationships in our life. Um, and so therapy can help you reestablish some of those relationships. So, what should we do to help others who are grieving? I think this is an important one. A lot of times we learn the hard way by learning what not to do or what doesn't feel good. Um, and so I just kind of want to talk about a few things that can be helpful. So, definitely do not encourage someone to have closure or just get over it. Those words can be said directly, but often they're even implied or hinted at. Kind of like, I actually heard a coworker a long time ago speaking of another coworker who just experienced the loss of their spouse saying, well, wasn't that 2 weeks ago? And I was like, yeah, it was 2 weeks ago. Like that's that that was before I was in mental health, by the way. That was not a mental health coworker. Um, but so sometimes it's almost this implied kind of get over it. I think we need to help give ourselves time and encourage other people to take time when we're trying to support a friend that's maybe experienced a loss. We can talk to people, join a support group. Sometimes, though, when we talk to people, again, it's that awkward, like if I bring up this loss, then all of a sudden other people feel really awkward and they don't know what to do with it. So they try to like make me quick feel better. And then you feel like, okay, now I'm caretaking for you because you feel, upset that I brought this up. Um, when really, it could be something as simple as like, hey, I'm posting on Facebook that this was my loved one's birthday today and I miss them very much. Maybe you're not looking for a lot from that. You're just trying to like express yourself. And sometimes people don't know what to do with that. And so they're like difficult emotion, shut down, turn into robotic form. Um, so I think it's important to give yourself that permission or encourage others to be able to talk to people. Um, and maybe you learn pretty quickly that there's just certain people that aren't as helpful to talk to. Um, and I've had some people say, I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to always call up my friend or my coworker or my, partner um, or my kids because they're dealing with their own stuff. I don't want to be a burden. Um, and a lot of people actually find out that to have someone to support you through that loss and to be able to share that can be so honoring of the loss, but it can also help build those relationships with other people. Um, Another thing that can help with the grieving process again is just taking care of physical health. I think about you know exercise, sleep, eating healthy, avoiding drugs and alcohol as a coping skill. Um, those are all important ways to really take care of our physical health because we know um, physical health and emotional health are so intertwined. They kind of can't have one without the other. It's also important to maybe find a new hobby or even focus on current hobbies. A lot of times you don't have the energy or desire to get out or to do things. And sometimes we say, oh, I'll just wait until I feel like it. Like, I don't feel like it today, maybe tomorrow, or I don't feel like it next week, maybe the week after. If you find yourself doing that too much, where you're always saying next time, next time, next time, it might come to a time where it's like, you know what, I just know this is going to be important for me to do this. I know I should go play tennis with these friends, or I know I should go play that game of golf. And like my client, maybe that first time of playing golf isn't the best because it's the first time. It's going to be difficult. You might not have that energy. Um, but she actually did. I mean, she was in sunny Arizona, not wintry Minnesota at the time, but she was able to then really enjoy the ability to go do that after some time. So that can be important. Therapy obviously is another thing that can help with the grieving process. And then something that I think is so important for any age that experiences grief or loss is to find a way to create meaningful rituals or traditions around the loss. Again, whether it's honoring anniversaries or um, I had a friend whose grandpa passed away, and the family joke was these shoes, these Velcro shoes that the grandpa wore. And so when all the girls and guy cousins got married, whoever got married first, they'd pass around these shoes so that shoes could be at the wedding. And that just became their tradition. Um, And actually, I saw a Facebook post that when one of them graduated from nursing school, those shoes were in just off to the side in a picture. Um, so, so it's important when you do that to really make sure that that it's meaningful to you. And again, that might be one of those times where the same tradition or ritual might not be meaningful to everybody in that group or that family, and that's okay. Then you're just giving yourself permission for, okay, maybe I'm just going to do my own thing, right? Maybe I'll just make it a habit of always taking the day off on a particular anniversary or a special date. And if someone wants to join me, that's fine. And if not, I'll just make it a special day, on my own, because that's still important. So it's important not to let other people's differing opinions prevent you from carrying out those meaningful traditions.